Welcome to day 2 of Nonprofit Driven 2021, and good morning to everyone. It is such a delight. It is an absolute delight to be here with you this morning. And I'm so delighted to be here with our panelists for this morning for the plenary. What a great day we had yesterday. So much learning and engaging and networking. I immigrated to this country in the 70s, an immigrant and settler. I am so grateful to live in this country, on this land, and on this territory. This morning, I come to you from land that has been inhabited by the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee peoples, and adjacent to the Kanakakaka community of Tyendinaga.
Hi.
And I want to talk to you a little bit too about Owen's work that takes place on traditional Indigenous territories all around Ontario. The ONN office is located at Foundation House. Elder Pauline Shirt referred to Foundation House as Sitskaskasewin, which means balancing one another. It's located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. ONN is so grateful and offers solidarity to the Indigenous people who have and continue to care for, protect, and defend this land. Although it is important to acknowledge the land, it's only the first step. Allyship is a continuous process. It's not a designation that one can earn and hold on to forever without doing. As settlers within the nonprofit sector, it's important that we recognize that colonization is an economic project based on land theft, genocide, and violence. As stated in the Yellowhead Institute Red Paper Cashback, we are all treaty signers and are thus responsible and accountable for the violence that Indigenous peoples face. The impacts of colonization and white supremacy can be felt, heard, and seen within every industry: education, health, social service, the justice system, the list goes on. As settler-led nonprofit organizations, it's particularly important for us to name the active role we play in perpetuating colonization and white supremacy through historical and current policies and practices. At ONN, there's a belief that as nonprofits, we must take seriously our role in responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. In our 2021 policies priorities, we've made specific commitments to settler Indigenous reconciliation and to promote the self-determination and well-being of Indigenous communities. This includes advancing our learning about decolonization and reviewing the calls to action of the TRC. We are so mindful of broken covenants and the need to reconcile with all our relations. Together, may we care for this land and each other, drawing on the strength of our mutual history of nation building through peace and friendship, keeping in mind the generations to come. So here we are together this morning. Today there are so many challenging, inspiring, and innovative conversations that are going to take place. So I invite you all to just listen and learn and engage. Remember the community guidelines we introduced yesterday. Please do that. Just be settled in what's going to come your way with an open heart. This morning's plenary session seeks to address the question, how does white supremacy permeate the nonprofit sector? Panelists will share lessons learned, practices of implementation, challenges, so many challenges that have surfaced on their journeys. We so appreciate them taking the time, because this work is not easy work, and talking about this work is not easy. It is energy that is being pushed out to you, and the hope is that you accept all that you learned today, like I said, with an open heart and an open mind. We want you to soak in all the information. You will have an opportunity to engage in dialogue with other sector leaders and members in the afternoon workshop session. There will be no questions and answers and an answer session for this plenary. The panelists, man, they are so great. I want to introduce you to Yodit Mesven Johnson. They are the executive director at New Shri. I hope I say this really wonderfully, but executive director at New Shri, executive director at New. I also want to introduce you to Shri Nalamothu, Associate Executive Director at Toronto Neighborhood Centers, Jessica Bolduc, Executive Director at 4R's Youth Movement, Juliette Nicolette, Policy Director at the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, or OFIFC. And this session is moderated by Yami Masosa, Network Engagement Manager at ONN. I'm going to hand it over to Yami to moderate. Have a great session.
Thank you so much, Garvia, for that lovely introduction and welcoming us into space. I want to invite everyone to take a deep breath. As we move through the session today, I want to remind you, as Guante has, that white supremacy is not the shark. It is the water that we are swimming in. White supremacy is a systemic and systematic phenomenon that is woven through our society. Its intention is to colonize our minds, our bodies, our psyches, our spirits, our emotions, as well as the land and the water and the sky and the air that we breathe. White supremacy tells us, or likes to tell us, who has value and who doesn't, in a way that reinforces racial hierarchy. Within the nonprofit sector, as Garvia mentioned, white supremacy is reflected in our current realities and has disproportionate harm towards Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities. It affects all sectors, all subsectors. And we want to be clear that this isn't a debate. We know that white supremacy and racism exist in our institutions, in our systems, in our communities, and in the nonprofit sector. Some of our organizations have been built on values that align with white supremacy, and we are continuously working to deconstruct that. It is important for us as individuals within this sector, paid and unpaid, board members, funders, all of us have a role to play and perpetuate in the ways in which we examine how we perpetuate settler colonialism, white supremacy through historical, current policies and practices. White supremacy is not just about adopting the language of being able to articulate it. It must be accompanied with action. And we must be accountable on an individual and on an institutional level. This panel serves as a tool to engage in those levels of accountability, those levels of self-accountability. And we are grateful for the wisdom of the panelists. And so the first question we're going to dive into today is our relationship to white supremacy. So I'm going to invite Sri to start, and then Yodit, to go into what is your relationship to white supremacy?
Wow, I want to start when I think about this, I want to sort of reflect on it in terms of the hardest part for me. And that is, for me, it's been the story of assimilation. I'm an immigrant. I come from India, which has its own history of colonization. And I think a lot about, sort of like those coronavirus variants, how colonization has its variants. And so I think about how I've come to settle in this part of the world, bringing with me my own variant of colonization, my own history. And when I think of colonization in relation to who I am, the place I come from, the community, the immigrant community that I grew up in, um, I think about that sort of divide and conquer kind of thing that white supremacy sets up. And I think about how that divide and conquers made it is the reason for why I think my community's been really good at assimilating, you know? And I think if I'm going to do reconciliation work in a proper way, truth work in a proper way, it's recognizing um, that that part of me, that sort of history that I bring that makes, I don't know, that's made me sort of connect and align with whiteness in a way that is deeply troubling, you know. And I think about the hierarchies that white supremacy sets up. I think about my place in that hierarchy. And the part that I think saddens me the most, that I find the most troubling, is it stands in the way of really kind of building solidarity and kinship among Black, Indigenous, and people of color, all of our communities. And yeah, it just undermines our ability to create real solidarity with each other. And so when I think about the present time and where I am with my work and my own personal growth, I think about ways in which, you know, I can work to decenter this focus on whiteness so that our labor, sort of redirected to our own health, you know, and redirected in a way where we can build the kind of solidarity that you know, we want for, address those sort of the lateral tensions and racism across Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, address that so we can really show up for each other in honest ways, in reciprocal ways, in healthy ways, stronger.
Thank you. Yodit.
Thanks, Sri. I think a lot about being in that water with the shark, right? Too. I am the daughter of an Ethiopian immigrant. Ethiopia is the only country in Africa that was not colonized by Europeans. And yet, when I visited some years ago, it took my breath away that beautiful Ethiopian women were having their hair straightened, right? And made to look like European hairstyles. And so I didn't have the language then, but I do now, of the way that white supremacy is a piece of interlocking systems that include internalized racism, include internalized sexism, include racialized capitalism, right? Include economic and social systems, as you mentioned, Yami. I am also the daughter of Detroit. Shout out to Detroit 313, the nation's largest chocolate city, where I spent my formative years and where my identity was shaped. And it wasn't until I was in a majority white community where I reside now on the unceded and stolen land of the Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe people that I understood the language of the other, which is what white supremacy perpetuates. I am also granddaughter of Dolores, of Mitzlau, daughter of Cassandra, mother of Tyson, and one of many generations now, 12 I can count back to, of Black-bodied or African-bodied women identifying folk who have had a particular relationship to white supremacy that's tied to our productivity. We have not only served our families, we have served communities, and in the context of the US, this country and nation was built on our bosom, on our labor, and on our families, particularly Black men who were erased, brutalized, terrorized alongside us. And so my relationship to white supremacy is that I have been harmed by it, and I have breathed that air and that water. And I'm actively healing my own internalized white supremacy, the ways in which perfectionism, the ways in which dichotomous thinking, the ways in which open conflict in certain instances. And I blessed Tima Okun and Kenneth Jones, who gave me language for that water I'd been swimming in when I needed it. And I am actively, as you said, trying to center healing, wholeness, rest in the practices of the nonprofit I lead, while I grapple with my entanglement in the systems that perpetuate violence against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color bodies and communities. And I was sharing before we got started, Yami, that I need time to continue to unpack the violence that has been enacted, not just on my body, but on my psyche. And part of how I combat the harmful nature of white supremacy is to be reminded that one of the conditions was to rob us of our innate practices, to make them very complex, and to sell them back to us in the form of the academy, the institutions, in the form of work, in the form of the liberal arts. And so I'm here today recognizing the limitations of our time, but the necessity of this dialogue. And I'm really grateful to be here.
Thank you. I want to invite Jess or Juliet to jump in. Yes.
Bonjour, Kinoea. Hello, everyone. My English name is Jess, and my Anishinaabe name is Biduya Bamatsi Benesis. And I am a member of Batchewana First Nation, and I'm calling in from my territory, the territory of my ancestors here in Powhatan. And this is Deuce. And despite all the efforts that I made to feed him, give him water, even lock him in the bedroom, he just wants to be here with me. So that's what's going to happen here, right, Deuce? I think that where I'd love to be able to take this conversation in thinking about my relationship to white supremacy is to name how unaware I was for so long that was the water that I was swimming in. When I think about the moment when I became aware, it was overwhelming, right? And I can see that also in the work that I do with other Indigenous young people, especially as we have more young people both being educated within a Western system, but also returning to like our ceremonies, returning to the land, returning to our pedagogies. Some of the things that Yodi was speaking to is that you begin to see the world in a different way, and it can be crushing. And so I think that for me, my relationship to white supremacy is both one of realizing some of the harm that I've even caused in my own life and my own relationships, both to like myself, my family, my community, and through the work that I do. And then this place of trying to return back to who I'm supposed to be, Anishinaabe Kwe. And what that actually means is something that is so complicated at times and heartbreaking at times. But it's also the thing that brings me most joy. One of the questions that we were left with was sort of this thought around like, what is the conversation underneath the conversation? I started thinking about the Matrix, actually. I'm gonna go there. And for those of you who haven't seen the Matrix, it was, I think it's over 20 years now, the first one that came out. But the idea is that, you know, humans have been plugged into, the Matrix is like an alternate reality that we've been plugged into. Almost like zombies, right? Like kind of living this alternate reality that has been created by forces outside of what we're able to control. And there's a moment where, you know, you become aware that you are living in a state that I feel like I'm not, all the Matrix fans are like, Jess, you're not doing this well. Anyway, so so the idea is that, you know, there becomes a point where you realize you're part of like a computer program that's feeding these robots, feeding this alien society. And, you know, alien society could be replaced with things like capitalism, with white supremacy, with patriarchy. But there's a moment where you become aware and you become unplugged from the Matrix and you join the resistance. So the thing to me that's really interesting about that movie, but also our reality in becoming in a relationship with white supremacy is that there's actually people who choose not to unplug. You become aware and there's a choice that can be made. And sometimes the choice is not to unplug. And so I think that for me, the conversation, especially when we're looking at the nonprofit sector, is to be able to notice those moments in ourselves when we choose to not unplug and we choose to perpetuate some of the systems of white supremacy in our work, in our lives, in our families, in our relationships, especially as like Indigenous people, for example. Like, what does that actually mean to be able to do that work and to be cautious of how we can move along all of these systems of oppression, but call them reconciliation or call them racial justice. And to me, that's where we're at, I feel like, with this work, and also what gives me like excitement, because it's like we're getting there, right? This is the work. And so Sri, what you were saying about being able to put our energy into building solidarity across Black and POC communities, it's like, that to me is like, that's going to be so hard, but that's also going to be so life-giving. So I just wanted, I'll stop there and give some space for some other folks, but thanks, Yemi.
Thanks so much. I want to invite Juliet. Yes, thank you.
So hello, first of all, my name's Juliet, and thanks for having me. And it's been a real pleasure to listen to the speakers so far. So I think that for me, as a queer white woman of Swiss Italian origin, obviously my first relationship to white supremacy is that I have benefited from it, and I have benefited from it in many, 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 many different ways. And that is obviously super uncomfortable, but it's also been something that has always been uncomfortable, and I have always wondered about and tried to understand why the world had to be this way, even as a small child. And so, you know, and what Jessica was talking about really kind of hit home. It's really about, for me, constantly examining the ways in which I'm complicit in perpetuating my own advantage, if we can call it that. It's obviously more than that, but my own advantage in a world that I don't want to see this way. And the reason that, for me, that I don't want to see it this way, and this is also related very much to the work that I do, very, very practically, is that if, you know, the colonial project is one that, and white supremacy, I think, is it's the same, really places, it's that dichotomous thinking that Yodit was talking about. It is win-lose. It can never be win-win, right? It is win-lose. So in order for me to win, you have to lose. And it just seems like such a, it seems incoherent, right? Illogical. Like, it seems like there must be a way that we can figure out to make things different. And so I guess from a personal perspective, I really work on trying to figure out what's the way that I can make that different. And it's super challenging. Like, you know, for all the reasons, you know, the job that I have, the family that I have, the city that I live in, like all of those things, it's just constantly, it is the water that we are in. And whether you want to actively engage in deconstructing it or not, it is. And that's the thing that Jess said that really was, I thought, so, like, you know, choosing to unplug or choose or not. Like, there are people who actively choose not to. And so in my work as, you know, doing policy and doing a lot of government relations, I'm really confronted with all the time with a clear set of people who want to unplug, and then people who don't want to unplug. And sort of, there aren't, and even the people who are like wanting to unplug, they don't necessarily know they want to unplug. They're like trying to, like, they're like, what? Like, they're groping their way in the dark to try to figure out, how do we do this differently? And yeah, so I think that, I mean, I could spin off on those things, but I think I'll leave it at that. It's that thing about, can we just stop thinking about it as win-lose all the time? And can we start understanding that it's win-win? Like, if you're better off, then I'm better off. And better off doesn't mean everybody having more money. It means, how are we well? How do we create a definition of prosperity that really speaks to, you know, I'm going to embrace this, that speaks to love, that speaks to healing, that speaks to real equity, and not like equity of opportunity in a job market, real equity in terms of people's ability to fulfill their human potential that they have on this planet. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. And I'm going to come back to, you know, something that you said, Juliet, and Jess, around the conversation under the conversation. And I'm curious how we can decenter whiteness while also dismantling white supremacy. And this could be a question for all panelists, but how we can decenter whiteness while also working towards dismantling white supremacy in the nonprofit sector. And if we can transition into that. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I mean, did you have that question for someone in particular, or you
No,
just
all panelists, yeah. All
Well,
of you can, yeah.
maybe I'll just start us off with a thought, because yesterday, me and my team, we actually we did a workshop with a group of actually nonprofit leaders within the youth serving sector across Canada. And we were trying to talk about reconciliation, and we were trying to talk about the imbalances that exist in the ecosystem or the landscape of reconciliation. But even in doing that, we started off by like orienting ourselves to like whiteness, to be like, we need to respond to whiteness, right? And so we stopped ourselves in that moment to say, what would it actually look like if we centered Indigenous worldviews and perspectives in a conversation around bringing balance back into our ecosystem? And where we came to within that conversation was, we actually have to take the humans out of the equation altogether. And to go back to, this feels like a very Indigenous trope, but we have to go back to the land, right? Like we actually have to start with like remembering the stories and the relationship that we actually had with our animal kin, with the plant kin, and using that as a foundation to build from, not the place where things began to unravel, because I think that's where we start. And for me, it's the place to start is to really go back to like our creation stories, and thinking about, like Anishinaabe have a creation story, but I know that there's people in cultures all over the world who have creation stories that give us ways to be in relationship with one another. So to me, I think there's something in this like decentering humanness altogether, to be able to gain wisdom that helps us to come back into relationship with one another in a way that is whole. And, to me, that context is so important because we're looking at like, all these young people at COP right now, the climate conferences, and the conversation that they're bringing there is like a completely different one than the folks in power. I'll start with maybe that idea, and maybe that might spark something for someone else. But we got to go back to the land, right?
Jump on that, Jess. Yes, for sure, to the land. I think that something that gets lost often is that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and I saw the person who's grappling with that, and I think I appreciate that, and I think that's part of the work is to grapple, but the reality is that folks that look like me and Yami are the global majority. And the fact that we continue to center white people, I think is itself, and whiteness, right, is itself that matrix, Jess, that you referred to. It's the way in which we're entangled in it. And when we get up underneath the conversation or we decenter it, I think about Norma Wong, a spiritual guide that I follow, that reminds us that we need to be looking at the long vision, that what we are creating today is for our children's grandchildren and their grandchildren. And so I want to especially just uplift visioning as a liberatory practice, and one that we carry, forward 7 generations and back 7 generations. And the importance that we think about a unique vision of resilience and regeneration and our interdependence, each of us outside of these constructions, that we're thinking intergenerationally about the impact that we can have, and that we give ourselves time and space to envision our own story of the future. Then we can come out of the shadows to be the protagonist of that story. And the clearer we are, not just about our vision, but the ways in which we want to be in relationship with each other, and the stronger those relationships, the greater our power is to transform these existing systems. And someone mentioned power, and I think that, when I think about the early equity work, one of the questions underneath it for me is, are we trying to move power from white people, for example, white bodied people, to who? To Black bodied people? Is that the goal of equity? That feels incomplete for me. I think about power in many forms, whether that's personal strength, community interconnections, political influence, community ownership, and self-governance, community governance of our essential resources and democratic processes. And I think that in this sector in particular, we not only are working at the downstream, but we're often not working from a vision that has been curated and created by the communities we hope to serve. And I think that we have gotten into the transaction of repair as though there would ever be a dollar amount or a transfer of land that could account or atone or reconcile the damage and violence that we've done. And so I think what we can do is create space for those dreams that were lost at that time, those prayers from our Indigenous and other elders, those hopes and aspirations that were lost in the violence of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and other forms of extraction and exploitation. How can we make room for those to be made possible and to build into this long arc of the future that we long for? And a note about, our white family is, as long as, and I won't be able to directly quote, but as long as you came here to help me and to not get free, you are not actually helping me at all. And so what I think Juliet offered is, what are the ways in which this violent system that affects us differently, and some of us more acutely, in what ways has it robbed you as well of your humanity? This system you think you benefit in, but that is really enacted violence upon all of us.
Sri, please go ahead.
What I'm hearing, and I think I'd like to touch on the idea of relationships and how that needs to be sort of at the root of everything that we do, and I really love what I'm hearing, because it reminds me that this is work that we all need to do for each other and with each other, and I think that yeah, relationships are just at the core of it all. And when I think about it, it's interesting, that the idea of what is under the conversation under the conversation. And I think one of them for me is, wanting to hear from people, wanting, white leadership to have this conversation, to sort of think about, there are intentions and there are actions, and to think about like that, you know, to step into that place of fear with us, right? To step into that place of being brave with us, and to sort of really think about, those harder questions of you know the language, you've, for the last few years at conferences like this and in lots of other settings, you've heard from people from racialized communities about what needs to get done, what people are looking for, what they envision. Um, so, what is it that you're afraid of taking action? Why are you afraid to take action? What are the fears that feed you? You know, into this sort of paralyzed state, right? Um, so I guess that's what when I think about the conversation under the conversation, and even the idea of decentering whiteness, decentering whiteness doesn't mean excluding white folks, our white colleagues, from this conversation, right? Um, they are part of this conversation, and it would be fantastic. I would love to hear from that. One of the things we did a dismantling white supremacy workshop at TNC over the summer, and the reason we were able to do it was, we'd spent 5 years building a community, through affinity groups at it within our network across these, 26 or so member agencies. So we have that rooting it in those relationships, we were able to sort of do this workshop series. And the practice we brought to it was sort of was called the listening circle sort of practice, where people just sort of spoke, and it was just listening to each other. And one of the things that came up in that was the question from racialized staff was um, feeling like, our white colleagues weren't showing up in the same way we were. They weren't talking, or they weren't sharing experiences in the same way we were. And so we decided to dig deeper into that question. And I think a big learning that came from that for us was understanding, well, what is keeping people quiet? What are they, what are all the fears that keep us from sort of being vulnerable and honest with each other? And it surprises you, right? Once you sort of ask the question, you're brave enough to step into answering it, you realize like, you know, we heard from our colleagues that, they didn't want to take up space, or they were afraid of saying the wrong thing, or, any number of things that were different from sort of, sometimes I go to that place of they don't care, or they're not, they don't want to give up their opportunities, or their sort of the ways in which they benefit, but it's not necessarily the case, right? So it's important, I think, we ask each other questions, the deeper questions, and step into it with each other, because we need to do it all. We just need to do this together. And then the other thing that I've been taking this class with a Nigerian philosopher, called, his name is Bayo Akomolafe. And the thing about, I love his work because he asks us to sort of challenge that, our ideas of what progress is, right? This progress narrative that we keep clinging to. And he says something that in one of the classes that just has lodged in my brain and in my heart. And he says, we need to fail into new dimensions of being. And I love that, because I think that challenges that whole idea, that's come up, other people have mentioned about sort of, what success looks like. And I feel like, if we're always striving to do it right, or do it correct, or find that one answer, we don't look at the ways in which we're failing, right? And learn from that. And how, I mean, we've never done this before, so we're going to fail. So let's fail and examine that and move from that, right?
Fail and fail better. Juliet, I wanted to hand the mic over to you.
Sure. I mean, I keep having, there's like a million things that pop up. I wanted to, one of the things that occurred to me, there are a couple of things I want to say. So one of them was that, when Judith was saying that white supremacy harms everyone, and when I position myself as saying, I've benefited, I'm conscious of that, how that is framed. But what Judith's comment made me think of is, there's a really concrete way for me where I can, that is so salient in everybody's life, really, where white supremacy and colonization has and continues to harm us. And that is specifically in the erasure of understandings of relationship, that the understanding of relationships specifically that Jessica was talking about, which decenter humanness and actually speak to the planet and all of its life. And now here we are in this place where I don't know if my kids are going to be living on a continent that's burning up, because colonization has eliminated, or sought to eliminate, but taken outside of the general discourse, the main discourse, worldviews that offer us solutions. So that is a way in which I am directly harmed, and it angers me. But I am directly harmed, and we're all directly harmed by. It's a really concrete example of how it harms everybody, right? That's one of the things that I was thinking about. And then I wanted to speak a little bit to some of the things that Sri was talking about like why people don't want to have these conversations. And for sure, I'm sure, including me, it's often I don't want to take up space and those things that you mentioned. I think, however, there's also what I feel like I encounter in the conversation about, and also in the work around decolonization, is a lack of imagination of, and it goes back to that question of win, 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 lose, but a lack of imagination around what could it look like if it was win-win? What could it look like if we were going to do this differently? And I'm reminded, and I apologize for the language, I'm reminded of a bumper sticker I saw on a massive pickup truck just north of Toronto a couple months ago. And the bumper sticker said, "I'm pro pipeline because this truck doesn't run on fairy tales and unicorn piss." And I thought, what an absolutely insane thing to say, because you can't imagine plugging your truck in to make it go instead of putting gas in it, right? So it was a very, I think that there's some work that needs to be done around imagination and that, you know, the vision and the dream and all that kind of stuff. I think that that's part of it. Anyway.
Speaking of visions and dreams, I want to invite us to move into, and it's been mentioned in different areas, and I just want folks to know that source your questions, because we're going to be in dialogue this afternoon. But how can we, and starting off with Yoditen, you know, free flowing to whoever wants to go next, how can we center practices of healing and collective healing around white supremacy within the nonprofit sector as well as individually? And how do we bring those cultures into our organizations?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I was just grabbing a link to Resma Menacem's book for folks, My Grandmother's Hand. A really powerful tool for Black, brown, and white-bodied folk to think about the ways in which internalized racial trauma, right? That violence that I talked about, the epigenetic violence that exists and that we're trying to heal. And let's remember that we're in a context where, you know, self-care has been commodified, right? That, you know, we get a mani-pedi or a massage and go back into the battlefield. And so what I've been trying to do at New, one, first and foremost, as leaders, we have an obligation to model what we want in the same way that as a mother, you know, I have to model for my son the values that we uphold. And so first is to institutionalize the values of, you know, reverence for our humanity, right? For others. And then we have to operationalize that. And one of the ways I've done that recently is to enact a flexible time off policy, to move away from the quote unquote 40-hour work week, to ensure our staff know that I trust them, and also that we operate in high levels of accountability. And what that looks like is you take the time you need, but you get your work done, because we are here with the blessing from the community to serve, to move resources. I think the other thing that we've done is to get more honest about naming, at least here in our community and in the state of Michigan, and I think this expands the entire sector, but I can't speak for everybody, is to name racism and other forms of oppression, particularly against Black, brown, and queer folk, as a root cause for why this sector exists, and to acknowledge the ways in which we've been complicit in that, not in a performative way, but to say, we can use our platform to amplify the voices of folks who have been historically marginalized in this community. We can use our resources to invest in communities that have had extraction of resources or resources flow to an intermediary like New instead of directly to them. So what I'm uplifting here is that part of it is the individual work that we have to do. And I have to practice every day acknowledging trauma and harm and how that shows up, whether that's, you know, defensiveness in a meeting or, you know, not offering embodied listening, right? Then there's the interpersonal piece. How are we in relationship with each other? And so we are using mission, vision, core values at the root of every decision we make. And we believe that if our values don't cost us something, they're not the right values. And then institutionally, how do we use this institution that we're entangled in, this nonprofit industrial system that we're entangled in? It is where we are. There are 21 families that do eat because we exist. And so we're not going to sit at that, we're not going to be frozen by our complicity in the system. What we can do today is to wrestle with that, to acknowledge it, to claim it, and then to use the institution as a way to galvanize change, right? And I can certainly talk offline about more ways that we're doing that. But I will tell you that if I didn't learn anything in the last 2 years, I learned that everything I needed to know to lead through a pandemic, I learned from my mother and from my grandmother. I learned from Black women. And so if I want people to take anything away, it is that we have within us what we need. I am not waiting on white people to save me, my son, my community, the people I love. I am not waiting for somebody to, compel them to do the right thing. I'm beyond that point. I'm betting on Black and brown folk and queer folk to get us free. And in the history of the United States, I can point to Mama Harriet. I can point to the women in the civil rights movement. I can point to the women in the LGBTQ plus movement who every time we have gotten free, so have other people. So that's what I'm doing. I'm betting on Black women and myself to get me free. And if our white family wants to come along in that, great. And if not, I'll catch me in my vision for the future.
Woo! Preach. Handing it over to Jess.
Well, I'm just smiling over here is really all. I'm gonna come with you. Yeah, I mean, the question was again, remind me of the question because I'm so caught up in like wanting to get off this computer and go build something.
I love it. I love it. So, listen, I'm like, we can all go, so the question was around how to center practices of healing and collective healing and like what cultures that you bring within your organization to really center that.
Okay. Oh, I love it. Okay. So I feel like there's a lot of really great things that were really practical that Judith spoke to, just around like our pacing and the rhythm of how we are in relationship to work. And those are things that like we do in my organization too for ours. And in addition to that, we think about what does that look like to also center like an Indigenous perspective within that as well. And so, fall time is like moose hunting time, right? And so it's like, of course, take the time that you need to be able to go hunting and to feed your family. Those kinds of things I think are easy ways in which that we can actually make space for an Indigenous experience within our workplace and within our work culture, for example. We've been really working a lot as a team to unpack our trauma as a team, actually, because we also see the ways in which like our trauma manifests itself through a relationship that we might have with one another, whether that's codependency as a team, or whether it's, the ways in which that like our fear and our anxiety or our anger shows up, to be able to work within boundaries, because we also need to have boundaries in how we like care for one another as like teammates, to be able to look at how our trauma shows up in the workplace. So that's something that we've been really focusing on, especially this past like year and a half, because we've been able to work with folks like Healing by Choice Detroit. We're really also like learning so much from Black women who are like leading this work in other spaces, and are really grateful that there's so much generosity in what has been learned to share with others. Something else that I wanted to share is just like what we've been trying to pay attention to as an organization is how do we move from transactional relationships to transformational relationships? How do we begin to look at one another as kin but not just say those things, to practice those things? And how do we also practice self-determination in our bodies if we're trying to build self-determination and sovereignty within our nations? We need to start with ourselves. And so those are the things that we're deeply curious about and continue to come back to as an organization. And then while we're on sort of this idea of or on this visioning kind of scale, something that my team brought up, which I think could be a neat thing for ONN to pursue actually, is we have collective benefits for glasses or dental care and things like that. What if we had a healing and wellness plan that allowed us access to therapists, to culturally relevant healing practices, but that we had resources to do that long term instead of just one therapy session? We need to build relationships with someone who's going to help to transition us through a time of healing. So maybe that's something that actually ONN could pursue and look into, is what would a healing and wellness plan look like that for your employees? And yeah, I'll stop there, and I'd love to hear from Juliet and Sri to see what they are thinking now.
I'll quickly pipe in. I mean, yes to everything that I've heard. Yodit and Jess, thank you for that. The only thing I'll add is joy, is finding, the joy in this work and in our relationships with each other, and not forgetting to be joyful together in this work.
Juliet, the last word.
I think that I thought a lot yesterday. I was listening to Kyla Judge, who's the young Anishinaabe woman up around Georgian Bay doing work. And she said something about relationships and how they're difficult for young people and difficult for, in organizational relationships, and how they make it difficult for young organizations to get going. And she talked about the transactional nature of relationships being a real detriment to being able to do the work. And one of the things we're extremely fortunate at the O5C. We have pre-pandemic, we have elders come in regularly. We have a lot of different kinds of cultural supports that are available to the staff in a variety of ways. And it's very much sort of a really good place from a decent work perspective. And one of the things that always comes up in the teachings is that relationships are about reciprocity. They're not about transactions. And so figuring out what does reciprocity mean, it's a small piece, right? Yodit drew the big picture. This is a piece. What does reciprocity look like in relationships? How do you make relationships non-transactional? How do you understand reciprocity to not be transactional, but to be about an exchange between, for lack of a better word, equals, right? An exchange between equals, an exchange between people or organizations that have different things to learn from one another. How do you make that real? And I think that that's a small step towards, decolonizing relationships, certainly in the context that I work in.
Thank you so much. I've been watching the chat. It's been live. Folks have definitely been affirming all that you've shared. And I know that this conversation, while limited to 60 minutes in this context, must continue respectively within organizations. And so I want to close this off again with, just expressing a tremendous amount of gratitude to our panelists for leaning in to a conversation about the water, about, white supremacy. We often focus on the symptom, racism, and so, or other forms of oppression. And so deep gratitude, because it's not easy to come up here. And to close off the panel, I want to invite us to think about how we can dismantle white supremacy and how it can be fun. Because I don't know about y'all, but dismantling white supremacy and leaning into practices of healing and reciprocity and joy are life-giving. And so as we move on this journey, inviting us to think of radical accountability, as well as how we can move forward in practices of love and joy. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you this afternoon as we continue this conversation. And there are resources at the bottom of the feed loop that you can access that have been referenced throughout the session. All right, have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take good care.
Oh, Yami, that was a tremendous, tremendous panel. Thank you to Shri, to Juliet and Jess and Yodit and Yami. Oh my goodness. So much to unpack there. I know that this work can be exhausting. It can be, but it can also be so fulfilling and life affirming when we jump into it with both feet and then support one another through it. So thank you for giving us so much of who you are and what you've learned so that we could jump in. Everyone can jump in both feet and continue this work. You know, yesterday's plenary also spoke of turning intention into action. And I think that's what we are all hoping that in all, like I'm a media person, that's what we talk about all the time in the work that we are doing around dismantling white supremacy, is turning all this intention and talk into action. So thank you all for all of that. Just fail into new dimensions of being. That was so good. So many good things. There will be a follow-up workshop to continue learning and dialogue on practices of unpacking white supremacy, which will include breakout rooms and lots of dialogue from 1 to 2:15 p.m. this afternoon. Yes, this was too short to unpack everything, but now you have this other opportunity. We will be joined by TK Pritchard of Shore Center for this session. So you get a break now at 11:15 sharp. There are breakout sessions, nonprofit think tank on the future of work. There's community finance for an equitable recovery. The top 5 reasons you need a plan for your nonprofit's reserves. That's also one of the breakout sessions. Couple of housekeeping announcements before I let you go. There will be a lunch break between 12:15 and 1. This afternoon, there are 2 breakout session time slots with a break in between. There are some really amazing sessions that are coming up. And if you didn't have time yesterday to join the visual journaling with Alwyn Wilson, make sure to join at 3:30 p.m. today during the networking break to create your visual journal to reflect, connect, and imagine. There's so much that you can reflect, connect, and imagine just from this panel alone. And there is still time to earn your points in nonprofit-driven scavenger hunt. Yes, fun and joy. Click on the scavenger tab on the left side of your screen and find out more on the how-to in the lobby. I'm so excited to see you back here at 4 p.m. Thank you again to these panelists. If you have time right now, just put one word in the chat of how you're feeling after this panel. Just one word for our panelists that we can leave with, so they can see how much we appreciate what they have done. I will see you all back here at 4 p.m. for our closing plenary. You don't want to miss it. I'm very excited to see Randall perform. Thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon. I'll see you at 4 o'clock.